The swimming pool of Auschwitz. The very suggestion of such a thing is ridiculous, isn't it? Why would a suburban summertime luxury exist in a death camp? Surely it's a lie. Or perhaps there exists a much greater lie? A conspiracy, even? Or perhaps the history of the Holocaust is far more complicated than what most people usually give it credit for. But in any case, what's going on here? Why is it that they never talk about the swimming pool at Auschwitz? Oh, and I can see the comments already, because the Holocaust, much like slavery, is one of those things that every time I mention it, in whatever context, it just draws out the crazy arguments. And whataboutisms and people putting words into my mouth, oh, they're the least of it. Because with things like the Holocaust, there's a whole other brand of crazy, that of denialism. You know, nobody ever seems to deny that slavery existed, despite, if anything, there being less evidence for that than there is for the Holocaust. Downplay slavery, sidestep it, sure, but never outright denying that it existed. I suppose that the levels of insanity are somehow proportional to the scale of the crime. But denialism is a particularly difficult thing to work with. Yes, in part because of how ridiculous it is. No amount of evidence or logic will ever be accepted because the conspiracy that's necessary to accommodate for it can just be made larger. You know what they say about wrestling with a pig, but there's so much more to the story of denialism, I think, and what makes it so difficult. Genocide itself is very rarely straightforward. Even the definition of the word can be tricky, let alone the means by which it is carried out. And the Holocaust is no exception. It was an incredibly messy, complicated, chaotic affair which took many different forms across many different settings over many different years of the most catastrophic war that the world has ever seen. The Holocaust was everything from slaves working in factories, logging camps, and quarries, to paramilitary death squads roaming through conquered territory. It was pogroms and ghettos. It was anti-partisan activities, and ultimately, of course, yes, it was extermination camps. The ultimate end of the National Socialist state was the eradication of millions deemed undesirable for whatever weird reason or another. And yet, the means by which that end was sought to be achieved were many and varied. The Holocaust, to put it simply, was confusing. And that confusion is precisely what denialists are able to both abuse and simultaneously fall victim to themselves. And that is what brings us to the swimming pools of Auschwitz, which we shall hear all about right after a brief sponsored message. This video was sponsored by none other than Armchair History TV, the website rapidly becoming the premier way to view historical education content on the internet. Now, first and foremost, I respect Griffin for even being willing to sponsor content like this, because a lot of times, videos that even begin to approach something like the methodologies of the Holocaust, as important as those topics are, can really scare advertisers away for pretty obvious reasons. And on the other hand, from my perspective, there aren't even that many services which I'd really feel comfortable with advertising when the subject material of a video is so serious and important as this. But Armchair History TV really is a great place where the history itself comes first and things like advertiser appropriateness comes last. I believe that discussing things like the Holocaust is very important. Not exactly a hot take, I'm aware, but the thing about YouTube is that, well, let me show you some statistics from the last time that I discussed the Holocaust in a video. These are the first 10 days of that video's performance. You can see how things were at first doing okay, as expected. The video was reaching some new audiences, educating people, and of course raising awareness, I like to think, about a genuinely very interesting and important question in Holocaust history. But then Well, you want to guess what happened after that second day? Well, that's right. That's where the video was deemed to be advertiser inappropriate, it was age restricted to 18 plus, and their performance absolutely tanked as a result, barely being shown to anyone at all. The really interesting thing, actually, is that even then, after the restrictions, it did have a weird little resurgence right here. And indeed, over time, the video did still manage to rack up around the normal number of views that my videos tend to get, although the revenue from those views was kind of abysmal, but that proves to me that people do enjoy this content. They understand how important this kind of stuff can be in spreading awareness to combat these very dangerous ideas of Holocaust denialism and, of course, just general anti-intellectual thought, which is unfortunately so common these days. My point is that Armchair History TV is aiming to become everything that historical education on YouTube should be. It's aiming to pay its creators a fair amount for their work. It's aiming to promote historical education without censorship and without hand-holding, allowing the viewer to determine what kind of content they want to see rather than, an algorithm or whatever. The website has over 150 exclusive videos in their library, again, a lot of which the creators couldn't realistically put on YouTube if they wanted to, and they're always adding more content to the library from a very wide variety of creators. Even I have a few videos on the platform. Now, those videos are admittedly a bit older, so the style is a little bit different from my current content, but if you enjoy this video, I'm sure you'll enjoy a lot of those ones as well. I have an entire series on the website where I talk about the history of the Second Boer War. I have a video about scorched earth tactics in the Peninsular War, and probably my favorite of them all, I actually have a video about the scalp economy of colonial America, which is another great example of a video that YouTube probably wouldn't appreciate all that much, but you can see it today and all the others by following the link in the description down below and signing up for Armchair History TV today. Thank you to Armchair History TV for sponsoring this video and helping to promote history even when it's quote-unquote advertiser unfriendly to do so. But speaking of the video, I suppose it's about time we get back to it. The swimming pool of Auschwitz falls under the same category as many, if not most, denialist points of evidence, right alongside the soccer fields and camp uniforms, the latter of which I've already discussed in a video. The arguments behind them are complete nonsense, but they aren't nonsense for the reasons that you might think. The average person, when they encounter someone talking about any of this stuff, will usually correctly identify what they're dealing with, and they'll discount anything that that person says. Holocaust denialism is stupid, so everything this person is saying must be a blatant lie. There never was a pool, there never was a soccer field, there never was whatever. But funnily enough, I think that is precisely the weak point. That's where individuals can fall prey to denialism. While the interpretation of the denialist is flawed, there actually is a seed, an origin of truth to what it is they're saying here. Because, at least according to everything that I could find, there was a swimming pool at Auschwitz. It isn't just some made-up nonsense talking point, like saying that the moon is a hologram or something. It's true, at least in a way. You say that it's nonsense to them, and the denialists, they can pull up photographs, they can pull up quotes and other evidence. They aren't, of course, saying that the Holocaust never happened, of course. They're just asking questions. They're saying, well, why would all this be the case? They're not ever going to outright say what they mean, at least when they're speaking with someone they might be trying to draw in. And the thing is, for every counterpoint that's going to be raised to them, there's going to be an answer. Another quote, another statistic, another date. Esoteric knowledge of the workings of the German government and convoluted rhetoric about the philosophy of National Socialism is something that they're going to be very well versed in. The average denialist is incredibly well rooted in very particular elements of Second World War and Third Reich history. They've read the memoirs, they've watched the films, they've consumed levels of propaganda that are totally even unknown to the average person. And as such, they are capable of providing to an individual who is totally unfamiliar with all this stuff a narrative which is both compelling and detailed, as well as being totally devoid of context. But for so many people, they don't have that context already, and they aren't trained to identify where that context is lacking. And if an individual isn't able to see where that context is lacking, well then you can see how that's going to open them up to flawed and potentially even nefarious narratives. The history of the Holocaust is very, very important, and yes, it's very complicated. The trouble is, so is slavery, and for that matter, the American Civil War, the English Civil Wars, the French Revolution, fall of Rome, warlord China, Meiji Restoration, the Russian Revolution, Indian independence, the partition of India. You get the idea. There is a lot of history out there. It's all connected. It all rhymes. All of history is important, and none of it is simple. It is sadly inevitable, then, that even the best education systems are inherently going to have to simplify or even skip over large portions of history in order to get the wider narratives across. You simply cannot teach it all. For my part, I'm not particularly familiar with the details of what happened at Nanking in 1937. I know about it. I've read one book on the subject, so in that way I actually am probably better than the average person who, at least in the United States, probably doesn't even know that Nanking is a city, let alone that some stuff happened there in 1937. But that means that potentially, if I'm going to come across someone who's like really, really well versed in like all those details and they want to spin something that's wrong, there's a possibility that they could do it unless I'm warded against it. I suppose that's not the best example using me because, well, this is what I do, and so I might be able to identify. But all right, another example. I know nothing about cars whatsoever. If a dedicated mechanic was sitting there and going through all the details and explaining to me how my headlight fluid was really low and it needed to be replaced, it's possible they could convince me because not only do I not know about headlights and how they operate, I also am not knowledgeable in the mechanics of how automobiles work. I don't know about internal combustion, really. I don't know anything about that world, and so for someone who seems like they know a lot, it's easier for them to, to pry that open, as it were. The thing is that even for the Holocaust, which proportionally receives a lot of emphasis in most historical education, like more so than, maybe other like kind of comparable events otherwise might, it's generally going to be taught in a very simplistic manner in order to get the most important points of it across. I mean, I'm never going to forget that my 9th grade history textbook somehow managed to fit the entirety of the Holocaust and the Second World War in about the same amount of space that it dedicated to the lasting impacts of 9/11. There's a lot of stuff all getting thrown in there. The functions and daily practices behind the Holocaust are the sorts of details which, for the most part, are going to be left by the wayside. The ideology and the rhetoric behind it, as well as what it led to, are simply more important when you're that crunched for space. But that does mean that to the average person, their only experience with those details of the methodology of the Holocaust, if they have any experience whatsoever, it's going to come in the form of popular media. It's going to be films and games, that one episode of Band of Brothers. It's going to be limited through their media, most of which oftentimes isn't even necessarily going to be based in primary sources themselves. What was the Holocaust? Well, it's when the Nazis rounded up all the Jews and threw them into gas chambers, and that's about it. Which means, then, that when someone walks up to you who seems to so clearly know so much about everything relating to the Holocaust and the Third Reich and the war and National Socialism and fascism, and they start talking to you about swimming pools and football matches, it's going to be weird. It's going to be jarring. And then after that jarring moment, they start to show you evidence for it. They start to show you photographs, unlike any of the maybe 4 or 5 you've ever seen before. They're going to start showing you quotes and interviews that they really don't sound like the monologues from Schindler's List. They start to show you rhetoric and arguments that your teacher never mentioned. And then you're intrigued. You maybe look into some of the stuff that this guy's been talking to you about, and you find the seeds of truth that were contained within it all. How could this be? Why would there ever be a swimming pool at Auschwitz? Why would they give the prisoners uniforms? Why would they tattoo them, for that matter, if all they're going to be doing is shoving them into ovens at the end of the day anyways? What else have you never been taught? What else have you been lied to about? And down, down, down the rabbit hole the victim sinks. There's a saying that's intended to be parody, I understand, but I feel like it actually fits really well here. 'Tis that an open mind is like a fortress with its gates unbarred and unguarded. In this case, the bars are ones of logic, the guards those of scholarship and of context. The typical person doesn't know a lot about the Holocaust, not really, and so if their mind is already going to be predisposed in some way towards any kind of conspiratorial thinking, whether they're like QAnoners, whether they're moon landing deniers, or whatever kind of conspiracy it is, often resulting from, I won't get into it, but more personal problems and the like. Whatever individual thing might predispose them to all of this, it's only a few easy steps then to fall into these traps. The Auschwitz swimming pool, at first, sounds like a contradiction to the narrative. It sounds like a kink in the armor of Holocaust historiography. But in reality, it was little more than an infrastructural quirk behind the means of the Holocaust itself. The pool, it was a water reservoir. That's it. Auschwitz was, after all, not just a single facility with one set of walls and a great big gate, like how most people unfamiliar with the Holocaust history might imagine it to be so, based on that, iconic image, the one that they've ever seen of the place. It was a massive network of camps and sub-camps, not merely holding thousands of slaves, but also housing administrative staff and guards. It needed storage facilities for the garrison's equipment. It needed fuel and food. The dreaded railway infrastructure, stables and kennels, medical offices, not always for healthcare. Any facility of such a scale will unsurprisingly be consuming and require great quantities of water. Everything from the needs of the staff to cleaning off equipment, hosing down facilities, being prepared in case of a fire. And thus, the network required its own water reservoir, the same as any town might if it isn't right on a river. And from there, ask yourself this: is it really that shocking to imagine that at some point or another, a collection of guards might have asked the commandant to take a dip in the pool of water that wasn't dedicated to human consumption? Even maybe, take an old plank of wood, make it into a diving board, have some fun, right? Especially on a day like the 31st of August, 1942, which was described by SS Dr. Johann Kramer in his diary as having a tropical climate, 38 degrees, that's Celsius, in the shade, dust, and countless flies. Much of Kramer's diary laments the omnipresence of flies in the camps and the heat and everything. One must wonder why there are so many flies around. But that's the answer. it's actually rather simple. In and of itself, it's an answer that's fairly obvious. But only if you're aware on a basic level of the sheer levels of administration required for a place like Auschwitz to run. Only if you understand the nature of how it was guarded and what was going through the minds of the guards and how, scarily enough, they were people just like the rest of us and they wanted comforts when they could be allowed. It's only when you've got an awareness of historical scholarship, how it works, and when you're capable of acknowledging what you don't know and of the appropriate ways to conduct research, that you can, well, that answer would be so obvious, right? At first glance, things like a water reservoir may seem strange, but in reality, they served an important function for the camp to be able to carry out its business. The same way that the so-called barber shops, where prisoners didn't get fashionable haircuts, they were shaved to prevent the spread of lice, which would ultimately impair the abilities of the slaves to have their labor extracted from them, where they were tattooed to make sure they could be accounted for in the slaving apparatus in case they managed to escape, or even just for basic accountancy purposes. Even more extreme, the ballrooms, the theaters, which were for the entertainment of staff and guards and officers, them forcing performers, conquered, captured, enslaved from all across Europe to come in and perform for them before they were shunted off to the chambers. It's important to maintain morale. Turns out it can be rather difficult to maintain morale among the staff and guards when the war is being lost on every front and you're sneezing out black chunks from the crematoria fumes that are perfuming the air. These are not the gotcha moments that denialists claim them to be. Did you know they had a musical symphony performance? Yes, that doesn't change anything. That's part of what makes the narrative so disturbing. It isn't a gotcha, it's the exact opposite. But the trouble is that nor are those things outright lies. They are necessary parts, logistically, economically, and militarily, of the camp system. And incidentally, for the soccer fields that denialists love to tout, well, I'm not sure about them having a dedicated soccer pitch, but we do have accounts of a football match, yes, being played between the SS men and the Sonderkommando. It was recorded, among others, by Elie Wiesel. It was held in front of the crematoria. Which is funny, because ultimately, even if all of it were true, even if all of these amenities were indeed available for the prisoners and not just their killers, it wouldn't really do all that much to improve the situation now, would it? Even if a prisoner could take a little dip in a pool, he'd still wind up taking a shower afterwards. It'd be like keeping a child chained in your basement, but giving him a slice of pizza every once in a while. It doesn't make the problem go away. And so the only thing then that remains for the denialist who's too far gone, potentially, it's for them to evade the actual questions, to pretend that the evidence doesn't exist, to inflate selected facts devoid of their context, all to account for an ever-growing conspiracy to justify that which is inherently a deeply flawed and a dangerous world view. Even when they're right about one thing, they're missing the forest for the trees. They're missing the mountain of corpses for the smiling guard at its base. And so before I leave you today, I'd like to offer up just a few more quotes, that diary I mentioned earlier of Dr. Kramer. I want you to think about the context in which these quotes were recorded, and how these words might be carefully both emphasized and redacted and crafted in order to create different narratives. And this is why I'm going to be showing you the full quote so you can see that full context. 2nd September 1942, 3 a.m., attended my first Sonderaktion. Dante's Inferno seems to me almost a comedy compared to this. They don't call Auschwitz the extermination camp for nothing. 5th September 1942. In the morning attended a Sonderaction from the women's concentration camp, the most dreadful of horrors. An army doctor was right when he said to me that this is the annus mundi. In the evening, towards 8, attended another Sonderaction from Holland. Because of the special rations they get of a fifth of a liter of schnapps, 5 cigarettes, 100 grams salami and bread, the men all clamor to take part in such actions. Skipping ahead a little bit. The 20th September, 1942. Today, Sunday, in the afternoon, heard a concert between 3 and 6 o'clock in the Prisoners' Chapel in wonderful sunshine. The conductor was the director of the Warsaw State Opera. 80 musicians. For lunch, there was roast pork. In the evening, baked tench. One must wonder where they received so many acclaimed Polish musicians. 23rd September, 1942. Tonight, 6th and 7th Sonderaction. In the morning, Obergruppenführer Pohl and party arrived at the Waffen-SS quarters. A guard was standing outside the door and was the first to stand to attention before me. In the evening at 2000 hours, dinner in the officers' mess, a real feast. There was baked pike, as much as you wanted, real ground coffee, excellent beer, and open sandwiches. As usual, I'll provide a link where you can read more from Dr. Kramer's diary below, alongside a few other sources that may be of interest to you. The diary continues with such events at length, recording every Sonderaction, which is exactly what you think it is, he attends, instances of sickness or injury among the camp staff that he encounters, and his continual efforts to remove the flies and other pests from his quarters. He also records his retrieval of live material, it's an exact quote, from the prisoners, being things like their livers, spleens, pancreases, and the like, for experimentation, as well as photographing prisoners with genetic defects, like webbed feet. It is wonderful and horrifying and disgusting to look into the mind of a killer like this, and the day-to-day operations of just one part of a much larger genocide. Now, I don't suppose that this video is going to do all that much to convince anyone who has already been lost to National Socialist thought. After a time, people like that need to be helped by psychologists more so than by historians. They need to step away from the internet for a little while, I think. But what I hope to achieve with this video is to provide some more context for how the mind of the denialist is operating and the means by which they are capable of recruiting more into the cult and again falling victim themselves. Never ascribe to malice what you might ascribe to stupidity. I am sure that most people who are Holocaust deniers believe in it very earnestly, and that is tragic just as much as it is infuriating. Especially when these individuals are unprepared for all of this, right? Whose minds might be left unguarded, often owing to, again, problems in their personal lives. Individuals who don't really involve themselves with, like, World War II history until brought to it by other elements, right? I hope that this video might represent just one more barrel of powder in the arsenal by which you defend the mighty fortress that is your mind. Historical education is important, and even more so, an awareness of how the field of history works, how historical research is carried out, how different forms of historiography function, and how to distinguish good arguments from bad ones. And so in that pursuit, I hope that you've all found this video helpful, and I hope that you found it enjoyable. I appreciate your taking the time to listen to me today, especially on subjects that are admittedly not as much fun as, you know, what kind of musket did the British use or something. And especially thank you to all of you who support my work financially via Patreon, and for example, by pre-ordering my book, for example. If you liked this video, I have a feeling that you'll enjoy that project, so you can check it out, link down below. I won't shill in a video like this beyond that. But otherwise, again, just thank you all very much for the support. And until the next time, my dear viewer, all the shilling besides, I am, and I shall, I hope, remain your most humble and obedient of servants.